Good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, it's been a minute since we last did this. How have you been?
It has been quite a minute, especially this way round as well. I feel like the last few times we've shared the stage together, it's been me presenting. So it's always good to be back in my purple abode and joined by you, Stephen. It's a pleasure.
Well, whichever way around we are, always partners in crime. Coming up tonight, tension rising in the streets of Los Angeles as 2,000 more National Guard are deployed to the city. Greta Thunberg has been deported from Tel Aviv. Novara's own Rivkah Brown joins us. And we speak to Phillip Proudfoot, who's currently in Beirut, about the situation in Gaza. And the decline in birth rates, it turns out, might be more nuanced than you think. Stay tuned for all of that. But now, before we start the show tonight, we have some really fantastic news. In just over 1 week, 797 of you have signed up to become regular supporters after we did a huge call out for 1,000 new supporters to back our work. We are truly and completely blown away. Our supporters continue to amaze us. They are the only reason, you are the only reason we exist at all. And you'll also continue to be the reason we can keep growing as an organization capable of taking on billionaire interests. We'd love to hit our target of 1,000 by the end of the week, and we really do believe that our audience can make that happen. So if you value the work we do here, please do consider signing up at novaramedia.com/support. US President Donald Trump has deployed an additional 2,000 National Guards to the Californian city of Los Angeles, as well as 700 US Marines. This military convoy was seen heading towards LA on Monday, thought to be carrying some of those military reinforcements. The additional troops are on top of the 2,000 National Guards already deployed to the city over the weekend to clamp down on anti-ICE protests taking place in some parts of Los Angeles. ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the US, is the federal agency tasked with clamping down on undocumented migrants across the USA. The LA protests are in response to ICE workplace raids in the city, with agents arresting hundreds of people in surprise stings on their employers. Now, the federal government's decision to send troops to California to police the protests is potentially an extraordinary escalation of an already hot situation, with California leaders calling the move authoritarian. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posted this justification for the deployment online. Due to increased threats to federal law enforcement officers and federal buildings, approximately 700 active duty US Marines from Camp Pendleton are being deployed to Los Angeles to restore order. We have an obligation to defend federal law enforcement officers, even if Gavin Newsom will not. Now, that's a reference to California Governor Gavin Newsom, the Democratic politician who's being blamed by the Trump administration for the protests. Speaking on the Pod Save America podcast last night, Newsom set out the gravity of the new military deployment.
And I'll remind folks, this is an act not just against the people here in Los Angeles, against the people here in the state of California, but against Americans all across this country, against the principles of our founding father that did not live and die to watch these authoritarian tendencies in action. And let me be now even more specific. The absurdity of this cannot be understated. There were 2,000 National Guard that were, quote unquote, deployed, of which only 315 actually were mission assigned. 1,700 have no particular role or responsibility. Yesterday, local law enforcement had to protect the National Guard. The additional 2,000 National Guard men and women that President Trump now is redeploying are being taken away. It's the 79th Infantry. These are I know these folks well. You know these folks well. These are the folks, these are the National Guard men and women that have been out there protecting you here in Southern California during the fires, after the fires. We are now taking many of them off assignments on forest management, protecting communities, vulnerable communities against summer and wildfire season. We're removing them from task forces that we've created to deal with fentanyl interdiction. I have 394 National Guard men and women down at the border. I imagine they may even be pulled for this theatrical display of toughness by a president of the United States who's unhinged and has now crossed a red line in this country And he has nationalized this order. This is not an order against this state. This is an order that can be imposed now all across the United States.
Now, Newsom has said he'll be suing the federal government over the deployment of the troops to his state. But Donald Trump isn't cooling his rhetoric. Speaking to reporters last night, Trump described the protesters as, quote, professional insurrectionists. I guess he would know. And today he remained unrepentant, posting this on Truth Social. If I didn't send in the troops to Los Angeles the last 3 nights, that once beautiful and great city would be burning to the ground right now, much like 25,000 houses burned to the ground in Los Angeles due to an incompetent governor and mayor. Incidentally, the much more difficult, time-consuming and stringent federal permitting process is virtually complete on these houses, while the easy and simple city and state permits are disastrously bungled up and way behind schedule. They are a total mess and will be for a long time. People want to rebuild their houses. Call your incompetent governor and mayor. The federal permitting is done. Trump, never a man to be able to keep on topic, seems to be confusing 2 different things: the protests and the fires that took place in Los Angeles earlier this year. And it seems like he's really angry about one and the other pretty unconnected. Don't know what the logic is. Despite the threat of additional troops, protests against immigration raids in Los Angeles continued for a 4th day on Monday. And in spite of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other less than lethal munitions, demonstrators continued to gather in the city. Protesters are demanding the release of large numbers of immigrants rounded up by federal immigration officers from areas of the city with large Latino populations. But deportation raids aren't just taking place in Los Angeles. Over the weekend, 2,500 people were arrested across the US each day, according to the Washington Post. The Trump administration has said it wants law enforcement to be making 3,000 arrests per day in the largest deportation operation in US history. As a result, protests have been springing up in other cities too, like this one outside an ICE facility in New York City. In Austin, Texas, police fired tear gas at protesters in an attempt to disperse dozens who turned up to demonstrate outside an ICE facility in that city. And several hundred protesters demonstrated outside the Department of Homeland Security building in Northern California's San Francisco. I'm joined now by Ben Camacho, co-founder of worker-led new publication, The Southlander, and a freelance reporter working in Los Angeles who was actually hit by a rubber bullet while reporting on the demonstrations over the weekend. Ben, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Can you start by telling us what you saw while you were reporting these protests? As I mentioned in the piece, Trump talked about organized insurrectionists. Is that anything that you witnessed?
Absolutely not. An organized insurrectionist, I think of right-wing paramilitary groups, akin to the ones that raided the White House on January 6th a few years ago. The people that I saw on the streets are neighbors, young kids that live in Los Angeles, whose family members and friends are being taken from outside their homes, from workplaces, or just off the street. And so what I witnessed on Saturday, it was a Saturday evening, probably maybe about 5 hours after an immigration raid had happened at a nearby Home Depot, which is just like a warehouse store, like a hardware store. Federal agents had come down into that area where it's just it's a local thing where day laborers who are oftentimes undocumented will kind of hang around the parking lot waiting for people to hire them for certain handyman jobs or construction jobs. And so federal agents came down, and very quickly, because LA has networks established for this, word got around, whether it's via social media or text or just word of mouth, and people showed up to the area and attempted to stop the federal agents from taking the workers from the Home Depot area. And so we've all seen, federal agents essentially tried to stop the protesters from advancing, and there was a lot of tear gas that was thrown. And so that was all happening in the morning. The tear gas did manage to disperse a lot of the people, but much of the intersection, about half a mile away, was still taken over by protesters who, kind of shut down the intersection. Locally, we call that a street takeover, where, they'll shut down a street with their cars and do donuts and just kind of almost have a block party out there. When I got there that afternoon, people had already been there for about 5 hours, and the LA County Sheriff's Department had been holding a line to stop people from going back to the Home Depot area. And so when I got there, the federal agents were nowhere to be seen, presumably were able to get away with the people they had taken earlier that day. But because these sheriffs were still there, the protesters were still there as well. And so what pretty much ensued that evening was a several-hour-long standoff between protesters, with protesters hurling, whether it's plastic water bottles or rocks probably the size of a fist or a little bit bigger at the sheriff deputies. But I think I only observed maybe one or two actually making it to the sheriff deputies. Whereas on the other side, sheriff deputies pretty much spent the day shooting these pepper balls that are very small, kind of look like paintballs, but they sting and they emit like a pepper. It's like a pepper spray into the air. And so they spent the day shooting those at people, at press, and shooting flashbangs into the air. One of those flashbangs actually seriously injured a press photographer. I believe he's British. His name is Nick Stern, and he had to get surgery because there was essentially shrapnel stuck into his leg. I witnessed this late that night. And I also was shot by the sheriff's deputies. I took 2 rubber bullets, one to my kneecap, one to my elbow. And it was really just an escalation from the sheriff's department to onto the protesters.
So there's been quite a lot of misinformation, recognizable misinformation online about, pallets of bricks being shipped in for the protesters. But it might also be the case that the media, both in the US and in the world at large, has kind of created a false impression of these protests. I don't know. I want you to say whether that's the case. I mean, we've seen images of, men standing on smashed up cars, burning driverless cars. Was that indicative of your experience of those protests over the weekends?
So I did see I think I know what you're referring to. There's a photo of a burned out car with a couple people standing with the Mexican flag on top of it. I did see that. And frankly, I thought it was a really beautiful scene because it means that people are showing up to defend their neighbors and people are demanding to be seen. The Waymos, which is those autonomous vehicles that a lot of people are against and didn't ask to be put into the city. Yes, they were burned down, but I think that's more of a statement against this like techno-capitalism state that's being pushed around us, techno-capitalist surveillance state that's being pushed on us. And so, yes, all of that does happen, but those just make for what we come to know as good TV, right? All of that kind of exists in the mainstream media and is great to hook people into or make people think like, oh wow, the city is burning down. The city is not burning down. The city is dealing with a invasion of federal troops, of military armed people, and people being taken from the streets and denied their due process rights. That's what the city is dealing with, and that's what the city is responding to.
But I want to ask you on that topic about the politics of the latest deployment of National Guards and indeed Marines to Los Angeles. It looks like from the outside, kind of an attempt by the federal government to undermine California's governor and Los Angeles mayor. Like, what is the story here?
Yeah, it's this. None of this exists in a vacuum. I want to start by saying that because I'm sure even Trump and Newsom are kind of like they're always on Twitter or they're on TV taking soft jabs at each other whenever they can. It's a really petty thing, and but I think this now with the military being sent in is absolutely undermining the state's right here. I believe there's a lawsuit now that was actually filed and was assigned either today or yesterday And they're essentially arguing that Trump has no authority to send the military in, especially because there was no agreement, there was no heads up. It was just a unilateral decision on his end to essentially occupy the city of Los Angeles with troops that are under his control. And so if you kind of zoom out a little bit, I think what this is leading to, when I see the troops that are under Trump's control, that have live rounds chambered into their rifles, and knowing that protesters are essentially fighting for their right to exist here, that to me is going to lead down a path where people are going to get shot or killed.
Yeah, a very, very dangerous escalation. Let me ask you about the cause of these protests, which is the federal ICE raids. Do you know anything about what's happened to the people who've been taken into custody? I mean, I was reading that perhaps some deportations have already taken place. Have you got any news on that?
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't know exactly what has happened to the people that have been taken in the immediate past few days. But what I can tell you, because I have been digging into ICE's data and looking into what is going on prior to last week and the weeks before, these are people that are getting fast-track deportations. I think key to Trump's deportation agenda is the trampling of our due process rights that essentially guarantee somebody's fair chance in court to argue their case. These rights are essentially being ignored for the people that are being taken and swept up by ICE. And I can imagine that with these raids, that has continued.
Ben Camacho, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you recover swiftly from those injuries that you received.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Climate campaigner Greta Thunberg has been deported from Tel Aviv after Israeli military forces illegally seized control of the vessel she was traveling on with 11 other activists on Monday. This is what Israel's foreign ministry posted on X. Greta Thunberg just departed Israel on a flight to Sweden via France. And here's Thunberg speaking from Charles de Gaulle Airport earlier today.
On international waters, we were illegally attacked and kidnapped by Israel and taken against our will to Israel, where we were detained. And then some of us deported, some are still there. There are very big uncertainties because it was quite chaotic and uncertain. So I don't really know what's going on. I haven't had a phone for many days. And
what were the conditions for you over the last few hours?
They were absolutely nothing compared to what people are going through in Palestine, especially Gaza right now.
Thunberg was one of 12 passengers aboard the Madeleine, operated by the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, sailing to break Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza and carrying a symbolic quantity of aid, such as baby formula, much needed, even if in only a small amount. While in international waters and flying under a British flag, Israel attacked the Madeleine with drones, and here's what happened next.
It's chemical. Okay, they're dropping chemicals on us. They're dropping chemicals on us. We don't know what it is. Look at this. Look at this. They are. Okay, everyone, take cover, please.
Take over, everyone. Take over and be careful.
The Madeleine's passengers and crew were taken to Israel in what Thunberg describes as a kidnapping. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz posted on X that he had, quote, instructed the IDF to screen the October 7th massacre atrocity video for the flotilla passengers when they arrived at the Ashdod port. Thunberg reportedly refused to watch the footage. Adala, the legal rights group representing the Madeleine's passengers, said Thunberg, along with two other activists and a journalist, had agreed to be deported. 8 Madeleine passengers who have not agreed to deportation are being held in Israeli detention in Ramallah prison. This is from the Israeli Foreign Ministry on X. The passengers of the selfie yacht arrived at Ben Gurion Airport to depart from Israel and return to their home countries. Some of the selfie yacht passengers are expected to leave within the next few hours. Those who refuse to sign deportation documents and leave Israel will be brought before a judicial authority in accordance with Israeli law to authorize their deportation. Consuls from the passengers' home countries met them at the airport. Remember, Israel is deporting and illegally detaining 12 people who have committed no crime, who Israel brought into the country itself to prevent them from providing a symbolic amount of aid to a starving, besieged, and brutalized population in Gaza. The Freedom Flotilla Coalition said this: "We continue to demand the immediate release of all volunteers and the return of the stolen aid. Their detention is unlawful and a violation of international law." However, the Madeline's voyage has presented a target for right-wing media personalities. Here are Sky News Australia hosts Gabriella Power and Rita Panahi.
She has just become such a laughingstock if she wasn't already, and it's brilliant. We have heard from Israeli officials that were reacting to this and keeping us all in the loop pretty much instantly. They clarified that all the passengers and the celebrities on board the selfie yacht are of course safe, unharmed, and they were provided with sandwiches and water. And this show is well and truly over. But just to put it into perspective how much aid they were actually carrying, it was less than a single truckload of aid, and just for some perspective, more than 1,200 aid trucks have entered Gaza from Israel within the past 2 weeks. Congratulations, Greta Thunberg. That has just been a spectacle for us all to laugh at, and she has completely failed. She's on her way back to Israel and then she'll be going home.
I do like the term selfie yacht, though. That's something new that we can have fun with.
That's peak Rupert Murdoch press right there, laughing at a young woman trying to draw attention to the greatest catastrophe occurring in the world at this time. Ha ha ha, very funny. This is pretty representative of the sneering coverage of the Freedom Flotilla voyage from right-wing UK outlets too. And UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, has had just about enough of it. Here she is speaking to Piers Morgan.
Fine, let me finish.
Today you talk about her grimace.
Fine,
Come on,
let me
can
finish.
we talk about Gaza?
I feel very concerned, as I've been saying loudly in the last week, about the ongoing appalling plight of innocent civilians in Gaza. All I can say for sure is that this stunt has done absolutely zero to help any of the people in Gaza. Zero.
This is your opinion, Piers, and
Yeah.
I respect it very much, and it counts 0.
Okay. Well, in that case, we will agree to disagree. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. I appreciate it.
You don't want to talk with me about Gaza and the awful situation there and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So you just wanted to talk about what you think it's a stunt.
Yeah.
You called me for that.
Yes.
So I'm international law expert, and you called me on your program to talk about Greta Thunberg.
Well, you've had nearly 20 minutes to talk about whatever you wanted to talk
I
about.
answered your question, Piers.
Yeah, you had 20 minutes. If you wanted to talk about something else, talk about something else.
However, I won't bother you further. Thank you very much. Till the next one. Bye-bye, Piers.
Bye-bye.
I mean, Piers Morgan, who's sort of positioning himself as a kind of international saint, now that just last week he recognized that Israel had gone too far in Gaza. And there he is attacking a group of extremely brave volunteers who crossed the Mediterranean to break the siege and draw attention to it. Very brave, because the last time people tried to do that in 2010, Israeli soldiers boarded the ship and killed a bunch of them. And yet there he sits, someone who has supported the Israeli government for the last 19 months on almost all of his shows, said that it had a right to defend itself with almost no limit, changed his mind a week ago and describes Greta Thunberg and the rest of the crew of the Madeleine as having done absolutely nothing to help the people of Gaza. Well, Piers Morgan, you did less than absolutely nothing. You did something to help the state for 19 months. That's killing all of those Palestinians in the enclave. So well done to you. The UK government's response to Israel's hijacking of the Madeleine has been predictably subdued. It urged Israel to handle its illegal detention of the activists safely and with restraint, in line with international humanitarian law. And a spokesperson for Keir Starmer has now also said this: "We have made clear our position in relation to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The PM has called it appalling and intolerable." But Foreign Secretary David Lammy announced today that Britain will formally sanction two far-right Israeli ministers, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Lammy said the ministers had incited extremist violence and serious abuses of Palestinian human rights. And he continued, "These actions are not acceptable. This is why we have taken action now to hold those responsible to account." Unacceptable and intolerable, unacceptable and intolerable. And yet somehow we seem to accept them and tolerate them for months after month after month. The UK now joins Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Norway in freezing their assets and imposing travel bans. Ben-Gvir posted a somewhat hysterical statement on X in response, saying this: "We overcame Pharaoh, we'll overcome Keir Starmer's wall too. Boo to the white paper." The Israeli government has blasted the decision as, quote, unacceptable and said its cabinet will be meeting next week to discuss the matter. Palestine Solidarity Campaign Director Ben Jamal told Novara Media this: "These sanctions against two far-right Israeli ministers are a long overdue acceptance by the British government that Israel is committing grave crimes against the Palestinian people, but completely inadequate to end Britain's complicity in those crimes or bring a halt to Israel's genocide in Gaza. The entire Israeli government, including its military, is responsible for continuing atrocities and deliberately starving more than 2 million Palestinian people, and is doing so with the material support of ongoing shipments of weapons from Britain. We need a full arms embargo now, and sanctions on the Israeli state, not just blocks on two ministers' bank accounts." While the eyes of the world are on Madeleine passengers, most notably Greta Thunberg, and the UK government tinkers around the edges with sanctions on extremist ministers, Israel's genocide in Gaza continues. Israeli troops killed at least 20 Palestinians trying to reach aid distribution sites this morning alone, and injured over 124 others. The latest massacre occurred near the Netzarim corridor south of Gaza City. Palestinian journalist Hind Kudoureh reports for Al Jazeera.
The situation is chaotic, there's no process, there's no equality, and the Israeli forces want this chaos because they have been targeting whatever policemen that are trying to organize, whatever policemen that are present on the ground, and this is how everything is going out of place, where there's chaos every single place. But where the incident happened today was in Netzarim, in the middle parts of the Gaza Strip. Now, Palestinians are saying that this is the only way they could get food. There has been no food entering the Gaza Strip for nearly 3 months. There's no distribution points. I'm talking about the old system of food distribution where UNRWA, WFP, UNICEF, and other UN agencies and NGOs used to distribute food for Palestinians. Now Palestinians are left with zero choices, either risking their lives to get food or facing this forced starvation on them. We have been seeing Palestinians, among those Palestinians being killed are women that are in charge for their children, and also children that are killed because they were trying to get and collect whatever food they could collect.
Ever since the Israeli and US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Fund was set up, there's been a mass shooting event with Israeli forces targeting and murdering civilian aid seekers reported almost every single day. The IDF claimed to have fired warning shots towards what it called suspects hundreds of meters from the aid distribution site prior to its opening. Statements from Israel in the past few weeks have made similar claims about distance and soldiers feeling threatened by starving Palestinians trying to procure food. The Gaza Medical Services Directorate reported that Israeli forces killed 3 paramedics and freelance photojournalists, Momen Abu Aloaf, while they were working in Gaza City today. The targeting and killing of both journalists and medical personnel are considered war crimes under international law. We say this a lot. And they have become common features of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Speaking of Israeli atrocities, also today, the UN has accused Israel of committing extermination, a crime against humanity, by attacking Palestinian civilians sheltering in schools and mosques across Gaza. In a new report released today by the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel, the commission found that Israel has destroyed more than 90% of schools and universities in Gaza with shelling, burning, airstrikes, and controlled demolitions. Over 1,000 children in the Strip have had no schooling for 20 months. And Israel's genocidal war on Gaza has killed at least 17,000 children in that time period and created more child amputees than anywhere else in the world. Helena, it's very hard to read that description of the situation in Gaza from that report and then listen to Piers Morgan banging on about how useless Greta Thunberg and her mission to break the siege in Gaza was. What do you make of the Madeleine's efforts, and what do you make of Israel's seizure of the ship, arrests of its crew, and now deportation of 4 of the members of that crew and imprisonment for the time being of the other 8?
I think one thing that frustrates me about this whole discourse, about this whole discussion around the role of Greta Thunberg and the Madeleine and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition and all the stuff that we've been seeing here is this constant need for people looking at what's being done by the Madeleine to impugn the motives of the people on there. We hear loads of different things about what they're doing and what they're trying to do, the role that they play in how we view the conflicts and how we view the actions of the Israeli state. And a lot of our press, a lot of commentators, a lot of just liberals in general, and conservatives, of course, too, tends to essentially hand wave away what's being happened here as virtue signaling, right? That's the phrase that we hear a lot of the time, although they're just virtue signaling. It's a very small quantity of aid. It is being done cynically so that they can either have some kind of level of self-aggrandizement or to be able to raise their profile, right? And this is the same kind of thing that you get levied at the protests, for example, that we'd seen in London against the genocide in Gaza. The people kept saying, right, oh, you just want to feel good about yourselves, you're doing things performatively, when, of course, that is essentially coming from the position, from the people who criticize it, of those who believe that protests or indeed symbolic action or the showing of solidarity like the Madeleine has been doing is only ever done just because of you feel like you want to do it and not because there's an actual genuine goal. There's a strategy that's being employed and a utilitarian end that you're engaging in this action for. For example, when we saw the protests in London, we saw loads of people saying, well, you protest Israel, but you don't protest Bashar al-Assad or whatever it is. I'm like, well, we're not sending weapons to Bashar al-Assad. We're not living diplomatic cover to Bashar al-Assad, right? Like the Ba'ath Party is there's no relationship to the governing party in the UK. Like this was a ridiculous comparison to make because the only understanding they have of activism is something that you do to tell people what you believe rather than because you have a certain goal that you want to achieve, right? And so when they look at the Madeleine and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition sailing, even with just a kind of symbolic amount of aid, they feel, well, no one's actually going to be helped broadly by the aid that you give because it's so little. And I'm like, well, first of all, even a small amount is all worth it, right? But if you're there having a selfie, you're doing it because you want to raise your own media profile. And it's true, they do want a profile, but they want a profile for the reality of the situation in Gaza, right? They want to raise 2 things. First of all, to show the world the Israeli reaction. The reaction of, again, committing essentially piracy in international waters against a British flagged ship. Of course, we've not seen any repudiation of that piracy from our own government. Just shows you how cut David Lammy really is to Israel. I'll come on to his statement about Ben-Gvir and Smotrich later, but it just shows you that the act that they've engaged in shows you just how pathetic Israel really are. Because they keep saying, oh, well, actually loads of aid is going in, right? We've got loads of aid. This is a small amount of aid, but we've got loads of aid going. Well, if you've already got loads of aid going and then then the siege doesn't exist, then you haven't really got a blockade because then you wouldn't care if the aid was coming in via a small amount through some kind of flotilla rather than being done through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which of course belies the truth, which is that there is still a blockade. What small amount of aid has gone through is being used deliberately and cynically to surveil Palestinians, to broadcast the scenes of people desperately reaching food as people who can't be trusted. They're trying to deploy this footage to portray them as being barbarians because of the scenes that are happening there. When, of course, that isn't the case. It's just what happens when you starve deliberately a civilian population for months on end. And then the third thing they've been using these sites for is to massacre these people, as we have seen plenty of times since the GHF was set up and went into operation over and over again, including allegedly Netanyahu funding ISIS groups to help carry out those massacres as well. And so the reality is, of course, is that they do want to maintain the blockade that does exist, and that's why they intercepted the Freedom Flotilla coalition. And the broadcasting of this specific relationship, the specific dynamic, is exactly what the Madeleine and its sister ships were specifically there to do, to broadcast to the world that Israel is so desperate to control and surveil and blockade the people of Gaza that even a small amount of aid they will block from being able to get there. Which is funny, because they keep saying to people who are sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, with the plight of the Palestinians being genocided, and saying, well, why don't you come to Palestine and see what it's really like? And then people do try and do that, and immediately, no, we're going to intercept you, and then we're going to kidnap you, and we're going to deport you, and we're going to seize all of your aid anyway. And then we're also going to show you October the 7th footage, as if somehow, seeing the acts of what happened during Al-Aqsa flood would change anybody's position on whether Israel's genocide is justified or not, right? Well, this is the funny thing, is that they continually try and preach to the international community that whatever we do is fine because this thing happened this one time, rather than taking things in a vacuum, understanding that there can be some lines you should never cross, regardless of how justified you feel you might be, which of course they still do. Which brings me on to Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, right? What is ironically probably a symbolic freezing of people's bank accounts. I would go further than Benjamin. I would go further. And what I would specifically say is that whilst of course the entire government is to blame and we should sanction the entire government, the blame lies in a society that's created upon settler colonialism, right? It's not just the government, because every government in Israel has been brutalizing the Palestinians, whether it's Likud, whether it is Yesh Atid, whether it is the Democrats, whichever party comes into government. Remember, Isaac Herzog is a Labour Party president of Israel. Doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum they have in government in Israel, the nature of the settler colonial project means that they do the expansionism, they engage in the apartheid, and that is fundamentally the fulcrum on which our support of Israel lies. And it shouldn't lie, of course. That's why we should not be supporting them prima facie. No diplomatic relationships, no ambassadors, no trade, no nothing, full-on sanctions on the entire country. Because this isn't a problem with Benjamin Netanyahu or the Likud party or Smotrich or Ben-Gvir. This is a this is a problem of Zionism. And until we see real justice across the whole of historic Palestine, where we see equal rights for all, we will continue to see this dynamic played out for generation after generation.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting juxtaposition of two claims about performativity there. On the one hand, you have people accusing people on the Madeleine, Greta Thunberg, and the rest of the crew as engaging in something performative and therefore, as they'll say, pointless. And of course, there is something performative about it. There is something about, taking high-profile people, going somewhere, and as you said, forcing the Israeli government to intervene to stop them from breaking the siege that the government of Israel doesn't want broken, doesn't want anybody seeing what's happening inside that enclave. But the real performativity comes from the British government and other governments who, instead of tackling the source of power in Israel, instead of tackling the state itself, let alone the government, what the state of Israel itself, Zionism itself, it constantly looks at the worst sort of outriders of that philosophy. It constantly draws our attention to the settlers, and like Louis Theroux's documentary on settlers, which is very, very good, very interesting, performs a kind of similar function because it does a little bit more of unraveling of the relationship between the settlers and the state, but it sort of draws our attention to like the most egregious, most sort of, in the case of Daniela Weiss, the most insane instances of Zionism. But actually, it's the whole structure that's the problem, and it's performative pointing towards these outliers who move into Palestinian territories is a way of distracting us actually from what is a fundamentally unjust, fundamentally violent, and fundamentally homicidal philosophy. Last week, Novara Media's Rivkah Brown published an exclusive. You might remember it. Using letters leaked to her from within the Foreign Office, Rivkah reported on how Foreign Office bosses had advised civil servants concerned about the UK's tacit support for Israel's genocide in Gaza that they should see a therapist or talk to HR or resign over their worries about one of the worst crimes we've ever seen committed in our lifetimes. At the time, we covered Rivkah's report on this show too, but now something a little curious has happened.
More than 300 members of the UK Foreign Office staff who signed a letter raising their concerns about UK policy towards Israel over its conduct in Gaza have been told by civil service leaders that if they profoundly disagreed with the government, then they could resign. The letter was sent to the Foreign Secretary David Lammy last month. It questioned the UK's continued arms sales amid what the civil servants called Israel's stark disregard for international law. The Foreign Office said in a statement the government had rigorously applied international law in relation to Gaza.
Do you notice anything missing there? You got it. Not a single mention of the fact that Novara Media broke that story almost a full week ago. Now, it's generally good journalistic practice to at least do your fellow reporters the courtesy of mentioning when they've broken a story first. But the BBC didn't bother, and neither did The Guardian, at least not at first, with their diplomatic editor, Patrick Wintour, running the story without a mention of us either. The Guardian, to their credit, has now updated that story to acknowledge Rivkah's work. The Telegraph, though, has run it uncredited too, as has The Times, as well as The Independent. They've got in on the action as well. It's pretty outrageous, I think. Earlier today, I was joined by Rivkah Brown, and I began by asking her to tell me how she'd come to discover her work had been cribbed.
So this morning I woke up to a story on the BBC and then on the Today programme, which reiterated my story, but without crediting Novara Media. So I was obviously delighted to see that the story had got picked up, and it's since been picked up by all sorts of national outlets, the Telegraph, the Independent, and elsewhere. The Guardian also, but very few have credited Novara Media, and the BBC has refused to amend its story.
Now, look, they say imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So I guess, nicking your story must mean that they think you're golden. But why does this matter?
Well, I think it matters because it's about acknowledging the legitimacy of Novara as a media outlet. Now, the BBC, or at least its journalist Tom Bateman, claims that he had the same documents that I had and therefore was working on the story independently to me and didn't copy his story from mine. Now, even if that's true, it's significant that a tiny outlet like Novara Media that employs some 20, 30 people could get its story out faster and scoop the national broadcaster, the BBC. And it's significant that the BBC chooses to omit that fact despite publishing their story 5 days later. Now, that omission gave rise to massive confusion. The BBC, not mentioning Novara Media, made many people, including The Guardian's Patrick Wintour, think that the BBC had broken the story. Now, who got there first might not seem like a big deal for many people, but having an exclusive story and scooping other journalists is part of the profession of journalism, being the person to get the story out there first. And I think it's really symbolic, this reluctance on the part of the BBC to acknowledge that we were the ones that broke the story, because it's a refusal on the part of the liberal media establishment to acknowledge the work that Novara does. And I think it's the same reluctance that makes the liberal political establishment undermine and ignore the contributions of the left politically, which is that to legitimate the left media or left politics would be to acknowledge its own cowardice. Now, you'll know very well that for the past 20 months, Novara has been at the forefront of covering the genocide in Gaza and calling it what it is. Now, only 20 months down the line are we seeing other outlets and mainstream outlets like the BBC doing much of the coverage that Novara has been doing since day one at much greater reputational cost. And so I think this story is a symptom of that. 20 months ago, we would have never seen the BBC rummaging around inside the Foreign Office, trying to find kind of dissenting civil servants on Gaza. And only now are they doing that. And only now are they realizing, is the country realizing that outlets like Novara Media had it right all along. So I think that there is a kind of embarrassment on the part of the BBC to only be not just getting stories like this, but getting the whole story of the Gaza genocide and its ramifications so late in the day.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. The BBC really not wanting to put people's eyes on this scrappy journalistic organization whose coverage of this genocide completely puts them to shame. Rivkah, people in the audience may not know quite how long it takes to put together an exclusive like yours. What was the process? How long did it take? And how did you do it?
So it was tremendously difficult, so it's a combination of making, clear to people that you're approachable for tips and waiting for them to come to you, and also seeking out through personal and professional networks, through tools as basic as LinkedIn to ones more complicated, people who might give you stories. And for months now, I've been cultivating sources within the Foreign Office, as I'm sure the BBC has, as I'm sure the Guardian has, people who might be willing to speak about this stuff, which, when it comes to civil servants, takes a long time because trust in journalists among civil servants is very low and fear of professional repercussions is high. And obviously there's kind of a huge job to be done fact-checking, ensuring that you can have multiple people verify your story, legal checks to ensure nobody sues you. The list goes on. I think people, including the BBC and Guardian, tend to think that the outlets like Novara Media are just talking heads. They're a group of influencers, but actually we employ lots of people behind the camera, lawyers, editors, fact checkers, and those are all the resources that we've poured into work like this. And I think that, it's actually hugely impressive that we managed to beat the Guardian and the BBC, mostly the BBC, to this story. And I think, the BBC should want to amplify the good work being done, by independent, much smaller and less well-resourced media outlets. But obviously, for politically motivated reasons, they don't want to do that. The thing is, though, we don't really need the acknowledgement and, legitimacy conferred upon us by the kind of establishment media. Ultimately, we just need our supporters to like us. And that's something that actually sets us apart massively from outlets like, The Guardian or The Telegraph, who rely on people kind of having giving them some sort of legitimacy, on a national level, being given awards and so on. And whilst Novara is starting to break into those arenas, and, we were nominated recently for Amnesty Media Awards, I've judged work at international journalism festivals by the BBC, by Channel 4 and so on. We don't need them to like us. We just need our supporters to like us. And in that way, we're actually much less vulnerable to the kind of vicissitudes of journalistic reputation than those other outlets.
Do you think any of those outlets are going to correct their copy to credit us and you properly?
So The Guardian, to its credit, has actually already done that. It took them a couple of hours, but they corrected it. So thank you to Patrick Wintour. Tom Bateman at the BBC, however, has doubled down on his insistence that the BBC shouldn't give us credit, despite the massive confusion that his article and accompanying news bulletins has caused. So we've submitted a formal complaint to the BBC, which will probably take a good few weeks to come back with anything, but we'll keep you posted.
That was the truly, truly excellent Rivkah Brown talking to me earlier today. And I think what this episode shows really is that Novara Media is setting the agenda. We're breaking the stories that now the mainstream are kind of copying. We're smashing into the mainstream, whether they like it or not. And your support allows us to do the kind of journalism the mainstream either can't do or can't even credit us with. So we obviously want to continue growing as an alternative to the mainstream, to legacy media, and your support is the only reason we can do that. So please go to novaramedia.com/support and sign up to keep us going, keep us growing, keep Rivkah breaking those great stories, or as John Moore put it in the chat, fund Novara Media so Rivkah can keep driving the BBC nuts. Helena, what do you make of this story?
I think it's funny that Rivkah said, well, we're all journalists, we're not just influencers. I basically just am an influencer, which is quite funny, but I think it's really important when you look at the work people like Novara do, is that when you look at the establishment media, there is a gigantic ideological bias to the centre and to the right, especially pro-capitalist, right? It's all very manufacturing consent. You can read Printy and Chomsky. and understand the material basis as to why stories that are kind of unique to a leftist perspective would never actually get broken or even pursued by the mainstream media, because that's not the narrative or the consent that they're trying to manufacture. So having people outside of that level of being beholden to donors, of being beholden to billionaires, of being beholden to shareholders, allows there to be a breadth of ideological positions within those organizations to be able to find the stories that would be missed elsewhere. What frustrates me a lot about British journalism as well, which makes it so much worse than so much all of the other countries in terms of journalism, is it's the ultimate closed shop because of the British class system as well. In that you look at the number of people who are journalists in this country, right? Like 52% of them went to private school, and a lot of them will go to the same private schools, and they'll go to Oxford and they'll go to Cambridge. So these are people who know each other. When they leave one organization, they just pop up with the next one, like, Allegra Stratton, is that the one who was at the BBC, at ITV, and then at the BBC, and then was Boris Johnson's press secretary? And you're just like, how is this kind of endless kind of merry-go-round of people moving around our political and media establishment allowed to kind of continue with nobody scrutinizing it? Like, who watches the Watchmen? And that's something that you get from having an iconoclastic media that presents a narrative outside of the mainstream media perspective, again, which is a material basis for that. And there's also a cultural basis as to why this has to exist too. And why it's very important that we stay, that we are no longer, that we are, sorry, it's why it's so important that we continue to no longer be beholden to corporations and big donors, because we have people at home supporting us, and that's who we're only ever going to be beholden to.
Yeah, those are the only people we work for, those of you who are watching us and supporting us. Like, for example, Karim Salman, who gave us €100. And they say, for the BBC et al. Being a bunch of wankers, we can say it, wankers, and support. Thank you very much for that, Karim. That helps a lot. But also do remember that if you want to make sure we get all of your money and not just some of it, go to novaramedia.com/support, because Google always takes a little bit from YouTube. The situation on the ground in Gaza is undeniably desperate, and too many nations are simply sitting on their hands and allowing Israel's bombing and starvation of the Palestinian population to continue unchecked. Now, former UN humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths and Institute of Development Studies research fellow Phillip Proudfoot are calling for a realignment of humanitarian law and humanitarian action to halt Israel's genocide and other atrocities in the Strip. One thing Griffiths and Proudfoot call for is that the international community invokes something called the responsibility to protect doctrine in Gaza. I spoke to Phillip Proudfoot earlier today. Unfortunately, the connection was a bit ropey, but I began by asking him to tell me what the responsibility to protect doctrine is and what it means to invoke it.
So the responsibility to protect doctrine emerged in the early 2000s, and it was formalized in 2005 at the World Summit. And it was a response to a series of perceived failings in the international community and the humanitarian system to respond to instances of mass atrocity, genocide, and war crimes. And it's a doctrine that says that when a state is no longer able or willing to protect populations within its territory, it falls on the international community to assist that state to fulfill its obligations. And if is unable to assist that state to fulfill its obligations, then it calls for a series of measures, starting with sanctions, targeted sanctions, diplomatic statements, and then ultimately, if those fail, rising up to the threshold of possible military action. So this was a really important diplomatic development that really, it was after the Rwandan genocide that people felt now, we really do need to start having a sort of legal standard, a diplomatic standard for when it is relevant for the international community to intervene to prevent mass death atrocities.
So you talked there about a series of escalating interventions by the international community, including calling for sanctions, statements, but ultimately potentially leading to what, like an international peacekeeping force deployed to Gaza?
It would be more than a peacekeeping force. So a peacekeeping force is deployed by the Security Council when there's been some sort of ceasefire or a peace to keep. So potentially it would involve the dispatching of military force. And it should be said that under the Genocide Convention, that does not have to be done through the United Nations. The Genocide Convention demands that all states act in such a way to prevent genocide. But of course, the ideal version of a military force would be a combination of battalions flying under a United Nations flag in order to force open aid and institute a no-fly zone and those sorts of pressures. But that would be the last stage. When we're talking about Gaza, we have to remember we're not even on this road yet, right? It's not that we are contemplating a military intervention, it's that we are intervening to support the military that is carrying out the genocide, or at least certain global North powers, or namely the United States, Germany, and to an extent Britain. So this is good as a norm, surprising as me and Martin in the piece that we've written today, that this is not even part of the sort of discussion when we would expect to see this in any other comparable situation. And to be frank, there aren't really comparable situations. This is some of the most egregious violations of the Genocide Convention that we've seen for many, many decades.
So just talk me through the process by which this responsibility to protect would be invoked. So you said it doesn't have to go via the UN. I mean, and you also said at the same time that there are so many Western states, as it were, supporting the perpetrators of the genocide. So what is the envisaged route for how this would be invoked?
The envisioned route is via the Security Council. And of course, the Security Council is an obstacle to the invocation of responsibility to protect in this case because of the United States that remains an ally of one of the genocidaires, of those committing genocide. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other diplomatic channels at an international level that haven't been tried or used yet. So, for example, there is a resolution in the United Nations called the Uniting for Peace Resolution, which was established specifically to get around a situation in which the Security Council is no longer fulfilling its primary obligation, which is to maintain peace and security. So it's clearly failing to maintain peace and security. Uniting for Peace is a resolution that allows the General Assembly to essentially take control of the Security Council's agenda, up to and including the commission of a United Nations military force. So, for example, this was the measure that was used during the Cold War to allow the United States to circumvent the Soviet Union and commission military force into Korea. Now, again, this is not what ought to be at all the step. The step should be now a series of vast and expansive targeted sanctions and diplomatic pressure to force Israel to allow the United Nations relief agencies to do their job. Military action is the end point. But the key argument that we need to make is that if the international community is increasingly recognizing that a genocide is taking place, it's not that the descriptive word we use is just a matter of language. No, the word we use, if we say genocide, then should in theory trigger a series of steps that can lead up to and extend towards military action. We aren't even, I said, on the playing board yet. There's a much further series of steps that need to happen, but many people are concentrating on people's now saying genocide. And that's good. People are saying genocide. It's been genocide for quite a while. But once you say that, then there's the question of what happens next. And what happens next in the international system is the responsibility to protect doctrine, which will need to be activated as more and more nation states recognize that a genocide is unfolding in Gaza. That is just how the international system is when it comes to genocide and has been since the early 2000s.
I mean, I think one of the most interesting realizations, perhaps, that's come out of the genocide for the international community, people living outside of it and looking to those international institutions to stop it, is that it seems to many as though this kind of order based around international law is just completely broken because, none of those things that you've suggested are happening. There's no widespread calls for sanctions, even though there is an increasing use of the word genocide. So it's part of the point of the piece that you and Griffiths have written to sort of record, as it were, the failure of the international community to act in the ways it should, given that increasingly the word genocide is being used.
Yeah, and I think the piece is also supposed to say that, okay, now we're saying genocide, so what? Now what are we supposed to do? What we're supposed to do? It's established. There are norms. And I'm fully aware of all of the criticisms. There are many around the responsibility to protect doctrine that this was invoked in order for NATO to stop bombing Libya. But that doesn't mean that the norm itself is wrong. It's been instrumentalized in the wrong way. But we either step aside and we say these norms don't exist, or we push and you're saying now what happened. It's really important, I think, for humanitarians like Martin has done in this piece to start speaking up more about the way in which our international system has been essentially weaponized by the Israeli state. And it didn't begin with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The humanitarian system has been weaponized in Gaza since the beginning of the blockade in the early 2000s. And now, for example, one of the key elements of labeling something genocide is whether you're creating deliberate conditions in order to cause irreparable harm to a population. So we can say that the siege, the 11-week total blockade of Gaza was causing irreparable conditions that will cause harm to a population through starvation. And we see on the point of food insecurity, the way in which these international norms and international system is weaponized by Israel. So the food security assessments that come out are rigorous and difficult scientific assessments of the level of food insecurity. And they always speak about impending famine or likelihood of famine or potential of falling into a category. The reason they do that is that they're warning systems, not as the Israeli state will reply saying there was no famine, they got it wrong. What they do is they then release a bit of aid in order to avoid the accusations of genocide and war crime. So they've taken our international system and turned it in many ways into a weapon. And we also see that in its most ultimate culmination in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which, as we argue in the piece, violates pretty much every single standard operating practice of a humanitarian relief operation. I mean, the most obvious of that is that humanitarians, we take food to where people are. We don't force people to go to one or two locations to collect food because it's dangerous, it lacks dignity, and it can lead to, overcrowding and serious harm. And it's distributed, I should add, not on the basis that we have established in the international humanitarian system, which is we distribute on the basis of need. We carry out needs assessments to figure out where the largest amount of need is and where to direct the aid. That's not happening in Gaza. Instead, it's being distributed on first come, first served basis, which is, again, never done by the international humanitarian system. So yes, all of these things are norms, and we talk about the order collapsing, but we have to be more vocal, people within the aid sector, around the ways in which Israel is willfully burning those norms.
We're probably all now aware that birth rates are declining in many Western countries, including the UK and across Europe. Here's a quick visualization from Sky News.
Now, this shows what is called the replacement rate. To keep a country's population stable, every woman must have 2.1 babies. So above the dotted line, the population is replaced. Below, it declines. And you can see that global decline in the rate in orange. But it's more pronounced in certain areas, including Europe here in dark blue and in the UK in red.
Now, this trend of lower fertility rates tends to be explained by right-wing commentators as the fault of selfish, career-driven millennials, or because young people today are a generation of adult babies who can barely look after themselves and lack the will and maturity to have families of their own. But the new UN Population Fund study released today found something quite different. The State of World Population report found that 1 in 5 people globally aren't able to have the number of children they want. The UNFPA surveyed 14,000 people across 14 countries, and most people expect to have fewer children than they would actually like. As you can see in the graph on screen, 54% of those surveyed said financial worries like housing costs, childcare, and job insecurity would likely mean they can't have as many kids as they'd like. Perhaps it's hardly surprising when young people in the UK are struggling to get on the housing ladder. Average UK monthly private rents increased by 8.1% to just over £1,300 per month in the 12 months to February 2025. And if you're renting in London, you're likely to spend between 1/3 and 2/3 of your income on putting a roof over your head. Last month, UK inflation jumped to 3.5%, its highest rate in more than a year, after dramatic increases in water bills, energy costs, and council tax. Couple that with the slowing of wage growth and rising levels of unemployment, and you've got a perfect storm of financial factors that mean people aren't in a secure economic position to be having kids when they actually do want them. The UN report also highlights gender inequality as a driver of both declining fertility rates and slowing economies. It cites a lack of gender-equal and family-friendly workplaces as one of the most significant reasons women don't enter the workforce. And who is speaking up for family-friendly policies in the UK? Well, it's this guy.
One of the problems is a lot of people who want to go back to work, and it's normally women. It's men in some cases, but it's normally women. There are other huge issues around childcare. Big questions that have been raised with me. Why in our big workplaces are there not creches when there are in many other continental countries?
Not Nigel Farage taking a leaf out of the EU's book when it comes to workplace creches. Helena, this problem of a low fertility or dropping fertility rate is often put in terms of social reproduction. Like, we're not creating enough of the next generation in order to support the state, the elderly, and so on and so forth. But it can also be put another way. I mean, it's just, absolutely miserable that economic conditions mean that for many people, and I'm not saying all people, but for many people for whom children would be having children would be one of the most meaningful things that they ever do in their life, they're not able to, or they're not able to have as many as they would like. Do you think creches in workplaces are the solution to this?
Against the wall, thinking about all the different myriad reasons why we see in 1975 just this big drop-off in birth rates everywhere. Everywhere across the world, we see this massive drop-off, and there are so many different theories as to why this is. A combination of factors of declining religiosity, increased urbanization, the rise of freely available kind of contraception. We see all these different things. We've got women in the workplace having children later, prioritizing careers. There's so many different facets to the reason why we got to this. And I couldn't, for any amount of analysis and looking at trends and looking at correlation, find which of these factors was the most important, because countries that are capitalist, socialist in the East and the West, from different levels of religiosity or completely secular, like all of these factors didn't seem, when I looked at the data, to truly affect whether or not there was a fertility rate that was going up or down or collapsing, when they all collapsed at the same time. All weirdly in 1975. It was very, very strange when I was looking at this data. And when you look at, for example, at the measures that are being proposed in lots of Western countries, right? You look at Hungary. Hungary is a country that's obsessed. It's obsessed with its declining fertility rate. You look at Japan, also very obsessed. And the states have tried everything. They have tried the whole gamut of policies to try and get people to have more kids, right? You see all these state policies, such as Japan wanting to do this kind of state publicly owned dating app to try and get people to meet each other. We had Hungary doing all these kind of tax breaks and cash handouts. And these things haven't worked either. It's been a real kind of conundrum as to all the kind of the gamut of policies that you would need to fix these problems. I'm not saying that creches in workplaces wouldn't necessarily at least have some effect, but I feel like that there's this kind of combination really of the necessity for people to be able to go out and work in an urbanized environment. When urban versus rural, you have far more kids if you live in a rural environment. Urbanization is happening everywhere and has happened everywhere significantly since 1975. And that is one way in which the living arrangements have made it harder to have children. And of course, not only have women been encouraged to work more often because it is a way in which we have created more gender equality, but they also haven't had the labor of doing child rearing taken off them broadly in Western countries, right, there's a thing called the gender equality paradox, which is that in the most kind of gender equal countries in law, a lot of gender imbalances still persist. If you look at Western countries specifically, you look at Sweden, you look at Norway, you look at Denmark, in terms of the professions women go into, the level of childcare that they have to do within their own family, even when both parents work, is higher than in countries that are outside the West. And for example, you look at the Soviet Union. Actually, they didn't see this big kind of drop-off in fertility rates in 1975. It was kind of middling throughout the entirety of that period because they urbanized pretty quickly and very, very quickly during the kind of Stalinist period. Obviously, there were other factors around that too. But they actually saw an increase in fertility during the 80s where it was dropping everywhere else, right? And so I think, in my mind, a kind of combination of a level of state input into childcare, the level to which that there was kind of guaranteed housing at 5% of people's incomes, is the places I would start looking at policy, right? Because even if you look at other socialist countries in that period, like Cuba, the high level of religiosity in Cuba you'd think would have them not have the drop-off in birth rates. Cuba's the same as everywhere else. It's the same as everywhere else in terms of the fertility rate dropping off in the 70s and the 80s, which you don't see in the Soviet Union. So I'm not trying to say I have all of the answers here, but the fact that the data is showing that the biggest concern out of everything that is stopping people from having the children that they want, not just from being put into the kind of ideological position where they feel like they don't want to have kids or they're prioritizing their own careers. They feel like they don't have the economic ability to be able to do so. So I think that plenty of things that we could do, such as investment in childcare, in stipends to people to have kids, or indeed, if we were to do things like having a 4-day week, if we were to embrace automation as a way of doing labor saving rather than as a way of maintaining corporate profits, right? Giving people more time to be able to keep a standard of living whilst fixing the housing crisis, and also giving them time to child rear at the same time, in trying to have a culture in which we have a more egalitarian approach, just like there's outside the West in some other countries too, and like the post-Soviet world, for men to take a more active role in child rearing. So in a new world where both people work, there is more incentive for somebody to want to have kids when it won't impact their career. These are all things that I would like to see. Do I have all the answers? Well, obviously I don't. This is just pure speculation, but it does seem to be a real existential problem that a lot of policies that have been tried so far have not been successful yet.
I mean, it's the definition of an existential problem. I mean, one thing that I've noticed, because I've recently been looking for a new place to live in London, is that, you know, I've seen a lot of new builds, new developments, people, you know, things being built, and nothing is built for having kids. Everything is built for flatmates and therefore for landlords. And so actually what government policy could shape in like urban areas where, you know, loads and loads of people now live is housing which is actually intended for kids. It's really sad. There are so many schools closing across London because people just can't afford to live here with kids anymore. And, you know, that seems like a kind of microcosm of this larger existential problem that you're talking about. Anyway, thank you for joining me, Helena. And yeah, thanks very much for being here.
Always a pleasure, Stephen. Always a pleasure to see your face on my screen. And I look forward to the next time, as always.
Yes, me too. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. From now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.